10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast, episode 419. Hey, everybody, welcome back to episode 419 of the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. This week, we're going to continue our series on the 5-to-1 progression by making it a tiny bit more complicated, putting the sort of next logical thing in line when it comes to this really, really important progression. So if you haven't listened to episode 418, highly, highly suggest going and doing that now. And for all of you that have, I hope you put in some work on practicing over that initial 5-to-1 progression, because now we're going to take what you hopefully practiced and those skills that you gained from practicing it and go to the next thing with it. All right. So last week we dealt with and talked about just how important this 5-to-1 progression is, the dominant 5 chord to a 1 chord. And we are dealing with major. We will talk about minor at some point, but right now we're dealing with major because that's a really logical place to start. And we were dealing with it in the key of concert F major. So if we frame this by playing an F major scale, we're dealing with this motion. 5-to-1, okay? And then I had you practice over this chord progression. That was 2 bars of the 5 chord to the 1 chord. So this week, we're going to talk about a really, really important concept, which I'm sure that most of you know about, but we're going to talk about it in this particular context, which is, talking about how important this 5-to-1 motion is. And the concept is that of a secondary dominant. Okay. So let's just cover what that term means first. So first of all, we just need to be clear on the fact that the term dominant means 5, right? So whether you're in a major or a minor key, 5 is also referred to as the dominant. Okay, so we just need to have that if we're going to talk about what a secondary dominant is. So here is the definition straight out of the dictionary about what a secondary dominant is. So in music, a secondary dominant is a chord that acts as a dominant to a chord other than the tonic. It's created by altering a chord in the key other than the 5th degree chord into a dominant chord, usually a dominant 7th chord. This allows the chord to resolve to a different scale degree, often to another dominant chord. And actually, this definition kind of nails it. But let's talk about it for a second. Let's put it into practice. So let's say that we're in the key of concert F major. We know that our dominant is going to be C. And if we build a chord off of that, we get C7, a 7th chord off of that. Okay. Great. So we've got our initial dominant to tonic relationship is C to F. But now, what if we did the dominant of C? So let's just imagine for a second that we're in the key of C. What would be the 5th step of that scale? Well, that would be G. So if we built a 7th chord off of G in the key of C, we would get G7. And that would lead us to a C. But in effect, what we want to do is we want to take this dominant to tonic relationship, this 5-to-1 relationship, and we want to be able to do more things with it in the key of F than just going from C7 to F major, right? If that's all that we could do, music would still work. It would still work, but we would lose out on the opportunity to do a lot more tension and release. So the way to do that is to create more, quote unquote, 5-to-1 relationships. So in essence, what we're going to do is we're going to create a 5-to-1 relationship before we create the big 5-to-1 relationship, which is C to F. So what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, well, I want to create a 5-to-1 relationship to the C. So therefore, I'm going to use a G7 chord that's then going to lead me via a dominant to tonic relationship to C. But then we're not just going to stay on that C chord. That is going to become the dominant of F. So now we have this chord progression that's called 5 of 5 to 5 to 1. And this is so important, right? Because that C7 is kind of doing what I would call double duty, right? Because when the G7 chord initially moves to that C7, our brains go, there's something weird going on here. Well, I heard a 5-to-1 movement, G to C, but weird that the C chord is not just a plain old, I don't feel like I'm home yet. But still, I heard that some form of that authentic cadence. Interesting. But then our brain naturally goes, but wait, it has to go somewhere else, right? And this, in essence, is how we get more interesting music by going through more dominant to tonic relationships. But you see, they're not always really dominant to tonic. It's like a chord that's doing double duty. So in essence, maybe the beginning of that C7 measure feels like we've arrived, but not fully. And then the end of that C7 measure feels like, oh, wait, we're still going somewhere else. So naturally, our melodic lines, the lines that we play in our solos, they should do that as well. And that is what is so, so, so important about this 5 of 5 to 5 to 1. This is one of the most important chord progressions to study kind of on its own. Now, I'm sure a lot of you are thinking, yeah, but 5 of 5 to 5 to 1, G7 to C7 to F major 7, is not what we normally see. Normally we see 2, 5, 1, which would be G minor 7 to C7 to F major 7. But we have to understand that that is something completely different than what we're talking about. We're talking about this 5-to-1 relationship, okay? But as soon as we make the chord G minor 7 and we move that to C7, we're not dealing with a secondary dominant anymore. We're dealing with modal chord movement, right? Because G minor 7 actually belongs to the key of F. So it's not the same thing. We don't lose, but the voice leading completely changes. So much of the sound of it completely changes. Listen to how different this sounds. Here's G minor 7 to C7 to F major. And here's G7 to C7 to F major. I don't think you can argue that those have two completely different effects on your ears. And we're concerned with the effect that is created by basically 5-to-1 happening twice. I hope that makes sense. Now, if we go back to our definition of what a secondary dominant is, it says it is created by altering a chord in the key other than the 5th degree chord into a dominant chord, usually a dominant 7th chord. This allows the chord to resolve to a different scale degree, okay? Now, obviously, when we hear that definition, we realize that a secondary dominant can go in way different directions than just 5 of 5 to 5 to 1. But I think this is a great, great gateway into understanding secondary dominance and hearing the kind of effect that they can have. All right. So again, let's get to your assignment from this week. So This assignment is going to be exactly what I was talking about last week. You were playing over incessantly, over and over and over and over and over again, just this C7. And I told you to do it like an unreasonable amount of times and sort of figure out the inner workings of it, figure out what works, what doesn't by experimentation and repetition, right? So you probably have a pretty good idea of how that concert C7 chord leads into that concert F major chord. But now you have another thing to consider. So now you're still dealing with a 5-to-1 relationship, but now you have to think about, okay, how does G7 lead into C7? Then how do I take the C7 and lead into the F major 7? So you see, we're just going layers removed, where now there's a whole other 5-to-1 relationship, that 5 of 5 to 5, which is weird because it's a dominant chord moving to another dominant chord. So there's a lot of considerations that you have to make there. And then we have to get from the chord that we just arrived at. Now we go, oh, this chord is doing double duty. So now we have to resolve the 5 of 5 to the 5. But then we already have to be thinking about how are we going to resolve this 5 to 1, right? And again, I will put out there that I think doing this just in one key and doing it mostly diatonically is where you're going to get the most benefit out of this. Just learning to deal with it on a base level is going to open the door to all the fancy stuff that you ever want to do. But we have to learn how to deal with this in its most basic form. And I think doing it in one key is really advantageous. Because guess what? All those sounds that you figure out that your ear is hearing and that you're putting together with your ear and not your brain, that's going to carry over to all the other keys. Then it just becomes moving parts at that point. I hear what I'm supposed to do. Now I just have to figure out how to make it fit into this key with the specific notes that are in this key signature. Okay? So the assignment this week is to incessantly play over the backing track that I'm going to provide you with this week and the trading tracks that I'm going to provide you with this week. And just over and over and over and over and over and over and over again, play over this as an isolated thing. And a lot of you that are so used to studying the 2-5-1 progression, this has the propensity to really frustrate you. It's very different. And you can't just fall back on your 2-5-1 licks. You really have to think about that voice leading of 5 of 5, dominant to 1. Okay? That's it. That's the assignment. Again, I'll give you the backing track. It'll be 32 times through that particular form. Patreon members will be able to get that. And then for the $5 members, I'll give you guys a little trading track so you can practice your skills with me and bounce off somebody else. So if you don't know what I'm talking about, we use Patreon to support the podcast and keep it coming out week after week. We don't do any advertisements on the show, so it's a listener-supported show. So if you're interested to that and you're new to the show, simply go over to 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or go to patreon.com and search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. You get all the info. You can sign up and you'll get instant access to everything that we've ever done. It's sort of the best deal in jazz education. And to everybody over there that's supporting us, thank you so much. We have over 350 members over there, keeping this thing alive. Can't thank you enough. We couldn't do it without you. So 10minutejazzlesson.com, click on one of the Patreon banners, or patreon.com, search for the 10-Minute Jazz Lesson Podcast. So get to it. Really, just practice this. Like, your family members and neighbors and everything should be like, stop playing over that progression. But that's a sure sign to keep going on it. And then next week, we'll talk about sort of the next step with this stuff. All right. I'll talk to you soon, everybody. Have a great weekend. Bye.